Yeah, so let's just have a quick look at making some network requests, so some HTTP requests. The common ones are a GET request or a POST request. We have a method built into the browser to make requests, and that is the Fetch API, which comes bundled with most modern browsers. Or a lot of people sometimes prefer to install, let me see if I've got it in one of these files. I think I've probably got it in here. A lot of people prefer to install Axios, or however you pronounce it, which again does promise-based requests very much like Fetch. And they set a lot of custom headers and things for you. Fetch makes you set them all yourself, whereas Axios can handle just the most common requests out of the box without you having to set some extra options to customize those headers. So a lot of people prefer to use it just because it usually just works, whereas Fetch you have to be a bit more fussy with what you put into it. Right, so I just wanted to essentially store some users' data on the back end. So we've already got some users' data here, stored inside of a function called user data. Then on our server, it looks like we got an API route set up called get user data. That just sends all that user data across the network. So in other words, if I've got both servers running, which I think I have, but there's an easy way to check, right? Let me just get rid of that warning. Front end users, line 2. Okay, import resolve from path. I have no idea how that got in there. It's not really a front end thing you'd be doing. Interesting. Yeah, so let's just jump back into the browser and check that we've got both of our servers running. So on localhost we've got a front end running, and on the back end, whoops, it looks like we've got a back end server running, and it says cannot get, which means we haven't set up a route for that particular endpoint. And that would be correct also. But if we went to the get user data endpoint, let's see what happens. Obviously I'm just doing this manually at the moment. We'll work out how to call it from the front end in a second. Cool, and there's our user data. So definitely both of our servers are working, the front end and the back end. Now, if we want them to communicate, then we can send some sort of request. In this case, it's going to be a GET request from the front end to this endpoint on the back end. We have a couple of ways we can do that. We can use a fetch, and we can put the correct endpoint in here. Yeah, let's just do that initially. So if we're using functional based components, then we would need to wrap our fetch inside of a use effect. Well, we don't need to, but it's the standard way to do it. Why do we do that? Well, it lets the page load first. So somewhere we're rendering some information to the screen down here. We're rendering our random users. Let me just delete that. That's from other things. So we're rendering our random users. Once we've got those users, we map over them, and what do we display? We display the name, the username, and the email for each one. So that's what we're hoping to see retrieved, and hopefully that's what our data contains, right? Name, username, and email. It's certainly some of the things that it contains. Okay. So at the moment, users is defined in the state, and it's just an empty array. So that's why when we go to the browser, let me have a front end and a back end one separately. So that's why when we go to the browser, we are not seeing anything because it's mapping over an empty array. So if I inspected the network tab, so this is what we need to inspect when we're dealing with network requests. And just trying to think now what I'm trying to show you. Yeah, let's do a split screen on the dev tools. Okay, so if I refreshed this page, we should hopefully see a get user data request firing off somewhere. Store user's not working, that's fine, but there should be a get user somewhere. Or we haven't written it yet, have we? No, so we've only fired off the store user, which isn't currently working. So we're going to create one for the get user data endpoint. So we create our useEffect hook, and it gives you this boilerplate template. Yeah, it's not necessary always that we need to do the cleanup, so let's just simplify it as much as possible. We can invoke the fetch API. Fetch API takes two things. The first is the endpoint, and the next is an options object. Options object can contain authentication headers, it contains different methods or what application data type or content type it is inside of the headers. All of these things can be stored inside of the options object. I'm just interested in the endpoint for now, and our endpoint was called get user data, I think. Get user data, yes. So both Fetch and Axios are promise-based APIs. Now, promises are a way to handle asynchronous code in JavaScript. So code that doesn't get executed straight away. It gets queued on a microtask queue in the case of promises, and only when the call stack is empty do we run that bit of code. So in other words, only when our function has completely finished executing, it's got down to the bottom, it's rendered our display on the screen, only then will the promise actually resolve. Where are we? It can get fired off straight away, so you can fire off the fetch request, and that will go to either your backend or an external server and start the process of retrieving this data, but it will not actually hold up the rest of your application. Yeah, it runs asynchronously. So the request is fired off, and then the program continues while we're waiting for that data to come back. Otherwise, you could delay your user. They could be waiting. You know, network requests don't take too long nowadays, but in the old days, or they're on a slow connection, they could be waiting a second or two just for this data to return. In the meantime, they're seeing nothing, or not a loader, not anything. Yeah, because it's effectively just stopped at that point. Yeah, so fetch enables us to create a promise. So that's a way of handling asynchronous code in JavaScript, and then we can use this syntax, the .then syntax, to chain on whatever we want to do when that data comes back. So typically the result or the response from the other network, we can do something with it. So for now, I'm just going to log it to the console just to check that we've set things up okay. Oh, in fact, that won't work as it is, because what we need to do with fetch, not with Axios, but with fetch, is to turn this data into a readable format. and typically we would do JSON. I always forget whether that's a method. I think it's a method. Did I have it down here? Yeah. So res.json, and then we can just say take that JSON and log it to the console, please. Input, don't worry about that. Is it going to complain? No. Good. So this use effect will fire off the request. The rest of the code will continue, convert the data that we get over the network to JSON. The data that we're requesting is this data, remember? And then just log it to the console. So if I refresh our page now, hopefully we're going to get, get user data is already there, and it's not red, so it's definitely returned something. And look, there is our JSON object. So stored inside of an array, because that's what the function did for us. And there is all our data coming from the back end, just with that request. If we miss off the, geez, where am I? Users. I should just go up here, shouldn't I? If we miss off this step, let's see what happens in the console now. Hopefully it hasn't cached it, so I can see. Let's refresh. Oh, it's still okay. I didn't expect that. So it's just saying that that was a needless step. Can you also see this delay here of sort of 300 milliseconds now while we're waiting for the rest of our data to come back? So all this time the user would have been waiting, yeah, if we weren't using some sort of promise-based API. And we're still not getting anything displayed. Well, that's because we haven't yet stored it in the state. So what we could do instead of logging it is we could set the users, right? So I'm still doubtful that this is actually JSON data, but let's see what happens. So hopefully it's an array of objects, and we can then map over them further down here in our code. Unhandled rejection, users.map is not a function, so it's saying that what we're getting back is not of the correct data type. So does it make any difference if we put this in? Because it clearly looked like an array. Now we're getting nothing. Objects are not valid as a child. So I think we've got an array of objects. Are we trying to map over them directly, aren't we? So users. Yes, we can't do users.map. Oh no, we should have been able to. User data. Can't spot it at this stage, unfortunately. So I'll quickly try it with Axios and see whether the data that we return from that is a little bit more in the format that we want. Axios from Axios. So you can just replace fetch with Axios. Do we have to specify what method? Nope. Should be able to then, inside of Axios, the data that we're interested in should be called data, so we can do res.data. Sorry, we can take the response and we can set the user to contain the response data. Okay, Axios is not Axios. It's not defined. Okay, good. Then let's see whether this is the data that we're interested in. Still no. Let's have a quick look then. A lot of red. Store user, get user data. It's weird because it's coming across. Line 58 specifically. 58 it was complaining about. Maybe it's complaining about that. Oh, okay, so it was something totally unrelated that was already there. So it wasn't the data that we were getting back was of the wrong form, it was some error object that was of the wrong form that was trying to render. So now you can see that we've correctly displayed the name, the username and the email from each. I don't know why we've got this post data button here each time. Is that being rendered as well? Yeah, essentially that, right? We don't need either. Cool. So yeah, just to recap, all we needed to do was use either Axios or Fetch to make a request to an endpoint. Then when that data is returned, we just set that data in the state. The data that we sent across was an array. So that means in our render, we can map across the array, extract the data that we want into variables, and display it in any format that we want. Any questions on the front end part before I move on to just explain the back end again a little bit? No? Then back end wise, well, that's why we put the data here. We exported it in the server, we set up a route, and we just sent the data across. So as long as this endpoint and your front end fetch match, yeah, then that request will execute the code on the server. So we've made a GET request. By default, all requests are GET requests. We made a GET request to that endpoint. So our server looks and sees whether we've got one of these endpoints set up, one of these route handlers set up, and sends back whatever we tell it to send back. Any questions, or should I just summarize with one other thing? Okay. So all these others are irrelevant, yeah. This was the only one we used so far. If you wanted to post data rather than...
Is it actually saved on a file in the backend?
What's that?
Is it saving a file? Is it updating the JSON file? Or just stores it in
Is what updating the JSON file?
post?
Post? If you want it to, yeah. I mean, usually we'd post something and then go on to send that to a database, right? So I've got like a database connection here. If we wanted to, and then that would... I've commented it out for now, but we would make one of these routes a post route, yeah. So like post insert movie, we'd connect to the database and then insert the data, not that data, but we'd insert we'd insert the actual part of the request that come across, right? We'd insert the request.body or something like that into the database. So yeah, we can definitely use those sorts of techniques to update databases or update what's stored on the back end. In this instance, we weren't doing that. However, we could do something like that. That would update the users. Yeah, so we've done a post request to store user. We create a new array called updated users. We spread the original user data and then just add on the information that has been posted from the front end. So that's how we would do it. So pretty simple, really. Just a couple of lines of code. As long as that route matched with, maybe this is in form. Yeah, rest.store user. So using a fetch request, you would have to declare method post, declare what type of content you're sending over. Makes sense to stringify it, just so it's easier to send as a string, and then that enables us to grab it on the back end. On the back end, we need a couple of things like this. So this will take stringified objects and turn it back into JSON. So app.use just means we're going to use it on all routes. It's a bit of middleware. It intercepts the request and essentially passes it as JSON if it's able to.
Are you recording this?
Yeah, it's all recorded, so you can go back and view the code, and I can zip up this file once I've tidied it up as well, and send it across to you. It's something you need to just play around with and look in the network tab. There's too many like ifs, and you need this and you need that and then this, and so.
That's marking the other thing with these files that we haven't created in previous session.
No, so all these files are new to you as well. Yeah, and obviously with the full-time guys, I've been gradually adding to this, but with you, I've just sort of got to dump it on you to talk about the topic, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, this was just a different way of making multiple fetches. So I was using the async await syntax rather than using the promise syntax. So async await is just a way of writing promises, but it's a more friendly way than user-friendly way than chaining on .lens. So what I did is just wrap everything in an asynchronous function. So that means that we can run, if we don't actually have any other code, but if we had some other code in this program, it would continue running, and these requests would not block any of that other code. So I've just made multiple fetch or Axios requests here, and I can use the await syntax to say, right, fire off these 3 requests all together essentially, but wait until all of them have come back with the data. So the utility promise was getting some electricity and gas data from this Heroku server that I set up with utility data on it. The user promise was going to a free API and getting some user data, and the Wes promise was going to Wes Boss, who gave me the idea to do this little bit, so I thought only fair to credit him. So yeah, we can await all of those promises, and then when we have got those promises, then we carry on with the rest of the code. So await actually pauses this function at that point. So once we get to line 8, line 9 will not run until all of the promises have resolved. Because if it did, if we took that out, well, the promise is going to get fired off, and then this console log will try and show you all the data, and we haven't got any of the data yet. So if I have an asynchronous function, I can type the keyword await anywhere inside of that asynchronous function, and the rest of the code will wait until this line of code has definitely finished. And in this case, that will be the promises have all resolved. What is the next workshop? I don't know what it is next week. I don't know if we go any further into this, or whether this is just sort of a whirlwind tour of fetch requests and promises. I'll have a look for you, but I won't do that live. But I think the best bet is probably just for me to send this code over, and then we can talk about it in subsequent sessions if you're interested. But asynchronous JavaScript is a huge area, right? It's something that you should definitely be aware of. So it's well worth playing around with these demos and examples.
I'm really interested in getting into all this.
Cool.
I know.
You know of it, but maybe not how to write it or stick it all together
I
yet.
know because I see this stuff in where I work.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So to get the insight.
So the guys you're working with are writing this type of code, hey? Nice. Yeah, but obviously for some people this is a bit beyond where they currently are, so it's probably something that I'll come over and just see you and Wes, and maybe if Alberto's here or something, I'm sure he'd like to see how it's done in JavaScript as well, because he must do it, but just with PHP. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, would be great.
I'm going to stop the recording there probably, and if you want to talk a little bit more about it, I'm available for sort of next 20 minutes or so. Yeah.